Hi everyone, this is Chapter 2, Ethics for Career Professionals for Counseling 4480. Introduction. Professional associations usually will have a code of ethics that is used to guide ethical behavior of the field. This means that it is going to focus on central values that are the foundation of the profession. So, really quickly, what that means is in every field, they believe that there is a way to behave and not behave. Okay, I'll give you an example of a different field. Let's say you're a journalist, right? Because that's very topical. So let's say that there was a really loud noise that happened at a uh, presentation. Okay, so obviously some people will say, well, that was a gunshot, right? But the thing is, as a journalist, you wouldn't necessarily say that. You would report it as it was a loud noise. We're waiting to confirm whether or not it is a gunshot. Okay. Even though in hindsight, obviously it was a gunshot, let's say, right? A journalist would not do it unless they had confirmation because maybe it was fireworks or something like that. So what happens is if it was a journalist and they did not follow their code of ethics, people would go, well, you said it was a gunshot, but it wasn't a gunshot. It was actually fireworks. So what's the point of having you here, right? I know that in this world today where we have a lot of people who do their own videotaping, right? And then putting it on social media. So some of that stuff is obviously accurate, right? But some of it are assumptions as well. So, code of ethics, when it comes to be a professional journalist, would say that they would need to confirm things before they would report it. Okay, even if it's obvious. And the reason why is because they want to make sure that everything they're saying has been proven to be accurate. Okay, so the same thing happens when it comes to counseling as well, right? So we'll talk about that and we'll explore some of the other circumstances, but hopefully that real world example helps you a little bit understand what it means to have a code of ethics and whether or not people are ethical or unethical. Now you're starting to understand when people say that when it comes to, let's say, their field of work. Code of ethics. So here we typically use the American Counseling Association, also known as the ACA. The last one was done in 2014. Typically, it is revised every 10 or so years. So hopefully it'll be out soon. You can find the Code of Ethics at www.counseling.org. So part of the Code of Ethics are going to address certain things, such as enhancing human development through the lifespan. So that basically means making people feel good about themselves as they go from, let's say, birth to death, right? That's what counseling is all about, trying to help you fix problems so that you can get and live a better life, right? A healthier, better life. Honoring diversity and embracing a multicultural approach in support of the worth, dignity, potential, and uniqueness of people within their social and cultural context. So kind of similar in the way, but also respecting people's differences, right? Which means your gender, your race, your, whatever it is, the intersectionalities that we've been talking about. Promoting social justice. So what that is saying is we have recognized that some people were treated poorly in certain circumstances and still today still are treated poorly, right? And we want to make sure that we are aware of those things so that we're not continuing to treat people poorly just because of who they are. Safeguarding the integrity of the counselor-client relationship. So that means confidentiality, privacy, and stuff like that. And then practicing in a competent and ethical manner. So competent basically means educated, right? And work experience. So we want to make sure that what you have learned in school goes along with the ethics, and typically it does in accredited schools, and then, to operate from this code of ethics. Values of a counselor. So what are we looking for in you as a professional in the future? There used to be 5, but now there's 6. Okay, so it's autonomy, non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. So veracity is the newest one. So you'll see 5 or 6, but now typically you're going to see 6. And let's go into the definitions of each one next. All right, autonomy, the right to control the direction of one's life. So, have you ever heard of autonomous cars? Autonomous cars means that they can drive themselves. So, here, when it comes to autonomy in humans in ethics, that means the right to control where you want to be as a person or where you want to go. Okay? Non malfeasance. So there is avoiding actions that cause harm. Think about Maleficent, right? Maleficent, the character, used to be about being bad, the word M-A-L, mal, right? So here's its non-malfeasance. So that means to avoid causing any harm to the person. So as a counselor, you should not harm your client. Beneficence, working for the good of the individual and society by promoting mental health and well-being. So to benefit, right? So what you're doing is you're helping your clients so that they are good, they're happy, they are behaving in a good way, and as everyone is behaving in a good way, our society is also better. That's what we're hoping. Justice, treating people equitably and fostering fairness and equality. Some of y'all might think the word equitable and equality are the same thing, but it isn't. So when you say you're treating someone equitably, that basically means that you recognize that some of us have certain areas of challenges and to be able to offer those people help so that they can catch up with everyone else. So let's say, for example, a person with a disability, let's say that they don't have an arm, right? So instead of saying, let's say, well, here's a keyboard, just like everyone else, so, you should be able to do the job. Instead, it might be a specialized keyboard so that they can type with one hand only. Okay, that's what equitable means. Equality is everyone gets a keyboard and that is it, right? But obviously, we want to make sure that both of those things are addressed. Okay. Fidelity is number 5. Honoring commitments and keeping promises, putting trust into the professional relationship. So fidelity, think of the word Fido, which is like a common nickname for a dog because dogs are very loyal, right? So this is kind of talking about loyalty or honoring commitments and keeping promises. You're being loyal to that person, putting trust into the professional relationship. And then veracity is the last one. That means dealing truthfully with individuals with whom counselors come into professional contact. So it means being authentically good and also truthful. You're not lying. Veracity, ver, usually is like a fix for the word for truthfulness, right? So to be honest about what is going on. Career Counselor Code of Ethics. Career counselors are also bound to follow the National Career Development Association, or NCDA. A code of ethics helps to define professional behavior and serves to protect the public, the profession, and those who practice within the profession. And that is at www.ncda.org. So a lot of the stuff that you'll see in the ACA are big picture stuff, and you might get into the NCDA as well. You'll see that actually some of it repeats itself. They're kind of very similar, but depending on where you are working, one might be the one that is being used more. Okay, so we'll explore this as we go along. All right, so the National Career Development Association, NCDA, there are 9 sections of the NCDA Code of Ethics. Number 1 is the professional relationship. Number 2, confidentiality, privileged communication, and privacy. 3, professional responsibility. 4, relationship with other professionals. 5, evaluation, assessment, and interpretation. Number 6, provide career services online, technology, and social media. 7, supervision, training, and teaching. 8, research and publication. 9 is resolving ethical issues. So as you can see, it's kind of like a table of contents, right? So let's say that you had a problem with where, let's say, you saw your client on TikTok and they're talking trash about you, right? So you might want to go into chapter 6 or look at the 6th section, and then you'll find out a little bit more about how they perceive how you would deal with that, right? Do you confront them? Do you not? You have to look at it, and it should be able to offer you some information and clarity about that as a counselor. Professional relationship. So now we're going to go and start to talk about some of the stuff that we saw in the previous slide, right? So the first one is core aspect of working with a client is the professional relationship. Definitely. You always probably hear about when you're working with people to build rapport. Rapport is just a fancy word for saying relationship. A good one, too, an effective one. So you first thing you want to remember is you need to do good and put the welfare of the client first. So we're not talking here like superhero jump in front of the client if there's a bullet coming at them or anything like that, but just in general, like most of us are going to be fine as counselors in the sense that like, no one's in any harm, like life or death situation, right? So you want to just make sure that what your client wants is the biggest thing. Obviously, it has to make sense with the services that you're providing, right? You're not going to go and do things that you're not trained to do. All right, practitioners provide only those services for which they're competent. Oh, I just said that, right? Which is that you should not be doing any type of counseling or services that you do not have training in. Okay, so let's say, for example, I do not know anything about addictions, right? I would not provide addiction counseling if I don't know anything about, what happens when you are a user of meth, let's say, right? Because I don't really know and I don't want to make any guesses because this is a person's life. So what I would do then, my ethical responsibility is to say, let me refer you to an addiction specialist so that you can get the services that you need. And that's it. Okay. Carefully document the services and actions taken with that client. So that means making sure you take all the notes. So if your client yelled at you for some specific reason, you have it documented, and then also hopefully you resolved it, cleared it up, so that everything will be okay, right? But you do need to document what the client is doing, planning, thinking, and stuff like that in an organized way. All right, the next one is follow state and federal laws and regulations towards record keeping, making sure that these documents are done in a specific way. You can't just write it like a text note or anything like that. There is a way of doing it. A very common one is called a SOAP note. There's also GURP notes and DAP notes. You will learn all of those things typically in a case management class. All right. Other forms are informed consent, which is basically to let them know before they start counseling with you that there are certain rules that we need to follow. So, for example, a very famous one or well-known one is if your client, you need to let them know that if the client says that they are abusing their children, right, that means that we, as a counselor, are responsible for calling the police because we do not allow for, let's say, child abuse or elder abuse or disability abuse. Okay, that means that your client is hurting other people, right? So the client needs to know this before you start so that if they do decide to talk about it, that they are going to be reported. Okay, must review verbally and in writing the rights and responsibilities of the practitioner and the client. So that's what part of the informed consent is all about. So you're going to have them, you're going to go through it, you're going to read it with them, make sure everything is, they understand everything in the informed consent. Types and lengths of services. So that means how long you're going to get it for, like 3 months, 1 year of services, of counseling. Billing. Who's paying for all of this? Because you need to get paid, right? And then, of course, the use of technology. Will there be technology between you two when you're doing counseling? And then what happens when the counselor can no longer be the counselor? So for reasons such as maybe pregnancy and then having a baby, so you're going to take some time off. What happens if you die as a counselor, right? What happens if you decide to get another job? What happens to your client? You don't want to abandon them because that would be considered unethical as well. So you want to have like a plan to address all those things if that's going to potentially be happening with you. All right, client's rights, so they should know that. Confidentiality and the limits. So again, like they said, you can talk to us about anything. However, if there are certain things that you talk about, we can no longer keep that secret. And the abuse is the one that's probably the biggest one, okay? To be able to see their records, so your clients should be able to request seeing your records. Right to participate in service planning. So that means that if they don't want to do any of the stuff that you're offering, your services, they don't have to, right? Right to refuse services, minor and their legal rights. So if you're working with children, they have a whole set of different rules, okay? Because they're younger than 18. They need parental consent for most things, right? So you need to know. And that depends on also what state you are living in. Mandated clients basically is people who are required to come because who come to therapy because otherwise they're going to get, let's say, kicked out of school or go to prison or something of something like that. So that means that they probably already do not want to go to counseling, right? So building that professional relationship and letting them know, hey, I get where you're going or you're coming from, and I know where you want to go, right? Let's work together because, what you were doing, what the decisions you were doing before wasn't really healthy for you, right? Or helping you. So let's work together. And that means building a relationship, a professional relationship. Counselors says we have to talk about avoiding harming clients and then aware of biases to avoid imposing values of their client. So biases, okay, to be biased. Bias basically means that you might have certain value systems and that might influence your decision making, right? So let's get this clear. We all have biases. We all do, okay? But what's going on is, as a professional, you need to go, wait a minute, that's something that, I was set to believe, but it doesn't actually mean that my client is going to have that as well, right? So, for example, maybe as a therapist, you do not believe in abortion, right? However, your client is coming in and talking about potentially thinking about getting an abortion. You should not, as a counselor, tell your client what to do, right? You talk it out and stuff like that. But you, because of your value system, you need to understand in the helping field, especially in a non-religious, typically, counseling field, you are not supposed to influence and put your own value systems onto your client. That would be considered unethical. Okay. So is it scary and hard and difficult for some of you? Yes, it's going to be true. So you're going to need to start to think about whether or not the helping field is your future if you are not able to influence people because of your own values and your biases, right? So here it says being aware of your biases to avoid imposing values of their client. So let's say I'm a therapist and I'm anti-abortion, right? And my client's thinking about getting an abortion. I'm not going to tell them how I feel about myself because it's not about me. It's really about them, right? So we want to talk about, like, what are your decisions about, or what are your thoughts on having an abortion, right? And let's explore those things. And then you can then say, let's explore, what your hesitations are. So what could happen there? What could happen this way, right? And then let them decide where it goes. Okay, so you're trying to be unbiased, right? Even though we all have value systems in ourselves, in our lives. Be aware of the potential for abuse of power when forming multiple roles with current or former clients. So this is an ethical issue because if you know your client because they have revealed a lot of stuff that makes them very vulnerable, you have a lot of power in hurting them, right? So this is something where you need to realize is you should just have a professional counseling relationship with them or a helping relationship with them. And that's it, okay? Otherwise, let's say you have a client who's really wealthy, right? And then they go to counseling, and then you're also able to convince them to invest in your business, right? And then now there might be an unethical thing because what happens if they decide to pull out and then you have no money and then you're like, well, I know all this secret about you, your personal lives. So then it becomes very unethical, right? Because you're kind of blackmailing them. And that's not what the standards of, the code of ethics is talking about. You need to do good to your client, right? No sexual or romantic relationships with the client, their partners, or their family members for at least 5 years or longer, depending on the state or federal law. So again, you need to look into that to see. So again, just in general, I'm going to say is do not have sexual relations with your clients. That's unethical because let's say you really find them attractive, right? But you also know where their areas of problems are. And then you start to play with them mentally and manipulate them so that you are able to have sex with them. That is considered unethical. Okay. Avoid non-professional relationships unless an interaction would be beneficial, like attending a wedding or a graduation. So here's an example of this, which is, let's say your client came to therapy because they wanted to finish their education and then, go to work, right? So they're going to therapy with you while they're going to school, and then they finally finish school. So this is the whole point of the goal. So they invite you to to their graduation. Should you attend? You can if you want to, right? That's okay. But I wouldn't make it a big deal where I'm jumping up and down, cheering for them or whatever. Just show up, sit in there, see them afterwards and say, congratulations, I'm so proud of you for achieving your goals, best of luck. And you can give them a card that says something like that, right? You don't need to give them a big gift or anything like that either, right? So that would be an okay, allowable interaction outside of work with your client, right? Does that make sense to you? And this is an ethical thing where some people might go, you know what, I don't feel comfortable with that. And they don't have to, right? Document the interaction and the benefit and the client consent. So if you do go, just write in your notes that you were invited, you attended, and that this is what happened really quickly, not a big deal, and move along. Fees and business practices. So now we're talking about like payments, right? Not referring clients to their own private practice unless organization has policies that allow for it. So think about this kind of like a let's think of a different field, right? Let's say you are a barber, right? And you work for a company. Let's call it the Academy Barber School, right? And you usually work there. Clients come in there. So typically, you should not go, hey, I'll hook you up with a discount if you come to my house and I'll cut your hair there instead, right? Because your company is losing out on a client like that. So it's basically stealing, right? A client. So that would be considered unethical for you to go work at, let's say, a counseling agency and go, hey, come to my office and I'll charge you less outside of this place, right? Okay, fees are reasonable. If there are policies to take legal action to collect fees, must be described in any form, informed consent, and also must offer clients the opportunity to make the payment. So if they cannot pay, you can't just immediately, go, legal on them immediately. Talk to them, remind them, see what's going on. And then also set the rules. Like if I call and request the payment 3 times and you do not pay, then now I'm going to need to bring legal issues into this or legal services into this to handle this, or a moderator, a mediator of some sort. All right, bartering should be avoided unless it is not exploitative, harmful, and is common in that situation. Bartering is just a fancy word for trading, basically, right? So you shouldn't do that unless it's been discussed and acceptable and it's not taking advantage of your client. Because again, sometimes people don't have money, so they might say, I'll offer you social media services or something like that in terms of, helping you with your thing and you can help me with my thing, such as counseling. So again, it really does depend on what you're bartering. And that could be ethical or it could be unethical. Client's request is the barter. So again, if the client is asking for this, this could be potentially an issue. Accepting gifts, depending on the culture context of the gesture. So this is a really big thing. Your clients, once they're done, they might be like, oh my goodness, I have now become the person that I want to be. Let me buy you a gift to thank you. So it depends. Typically, you're supposed to say no, right? So because that could potentially influence why you're helping certain people and stuff like that, not helping other people. Remember those 6 things that we were talking about earlier when it comes to the value systems? So let's say you're working at an agency and your client brings in chocolates, right? You can say, typically our agency does not allow us to accept gifts. However, if you insist, I'm going to take this box of chocolates and share it with the office. Okay, that's great. However, let's say they buy you a Rolex, right? Oh, it feels really, really tempting, right? But typically it would be considered unethical to do that. However, there's also cultural context that comes into this. For some cultures, if they buy you a thank you gift and you don't accept, they take it really offensively. So this is something that you need to decide how you're going to behave in terms of ethics. I'm going to leave it at that. You think about it. Termination is basically ending of therapy. Prohibited from abandoning clients. So remember we talked about before, you can't just leave them, stop talking to them. You need to let them know. And the sooner you let them know, the better. Okay. Suggest alternatives or referrals. Keep communication open. So that basically means like, if I can't see you, I'm going to refer you to another therapist in this office. Okay. And those are the rules, right? And then from there, if you cannot, then I will offer you a referral for another agency in the city or the community. Okay. Ends when the client is finished with the career plans or is no longer benefiting from the relationship. The client, however, can quit whenever they want. Okay. So, there's a difference between the two. You cannot abandon them, or you should not abandon them, and but they can quit whenever they want to. Typically, if they quit, I would call them up and say, hi, I just wanted to make sure that you permanently decided to, stop counseling. I've reached out to you 3 times and there have been a no-show for 3 times. And if you actually talk to them, you say, may I ask the reason why? And they might say, I feel better, and then you just document that and then you move along, you close that case, right? However, maybe there's we just weren't connecting, right? And then you can say, oh, is there anything that, we could have improved this relationship? And they could say, it just wasn't a good match, or maybe they didn't like certain things about certain, parts of the therapy. And, don't take it too personally, but learn from it. And then you're like, oh, okay, thank you for letting me know. And then hopefully you can improve yourself as well, if that's the type of legit criticism that they're offering. All right, confidentiality, privileged communication, and privacy. So earning and maintaining trust is really hard, okay? When you meet a client, they're going to go, who are you? How do I know you? And then for some therapists or counselors, if you're young, your client might go, you're so young. How could you help me with anything? So building trust is really important before starting to solve a problem. Upholding professional boundaries, so again, being ethical is something that people look into to build that trust. And then, of course, maintaining confidentiality. So whatever you talk about, you should not talk to anyone else about your client's problems except for yourself, okay? Obviously, if you're an intern or you have a day in your office where you all break down certain things, yes, for sure, your supervisor, but decide all those things before you start counseling. Okay, limits of confidentiality, as we talked about before, we have to report if there's any abuse or anything like that. Need to protect the clients from others or others from self-harm, others, or fear, child or elder abuse. So if they're threatening to kill themselves, again, we might need to then talk to a provider, like an emergency provider, so that they do not do that, okay? Or hospitalize them. Disclosing information about a communicable and life-threatening disease if the third person is identifiable and at high risk of contracting the disease. So this is also dependent on the state that you are in. If your client, okay, in California has HIV and they are having unprotected sex, you don't know who they are having sex with, right? So you are actually not allowed to tell the other person that they're having sex with. This becomes, why is that person that they're having sex with not asking? Does that make sense? There's certain responsibilities of that person as well. It used to be considered if you purposely do it, a felony, but now it is now done to a misdemeanor because of responsibility, and also because, let's say, for example, HIV, if you take medications and you are healthy, you actually cannot pass HIV to another person. It's called undetectable, right? It's untransmissible. I don't know if you know that or not, but yeah, feel free to go ahead and look into HIV prevention. All right, when it is court ordered, so you might have to reveal what you talked about with your client in the courts systems. It depends. You might start off with privileged communication, that's the term, and then we will, from there, the courts will decide whether or not that's allowable or not. It really does depend. Okay, so when the court is ordered, inform the client, let them know. Obtain written consent to disclose any information. So if your client wants you to talk about what you talk about in therapy with them to the courts, they have to write and sign that says, I give you permission. Okay, there should be evidence. Try and prohibit the disclosure Limit as much as possible the amount of information disclosed to minimize harm to the client. So you might not know the reason why they're in court, right? So you need to just answer the questions that are being asked and don't over offer more information. Okay. Must notify clients of third party payers as well. So again, payment wise, when it comes to going to court, there might be an issue there. So it depends. You'll need to decide on that situation. There's also group settings. Group settings are not very private because I, as a therapist in a group, can promise to not talk to anyone about this, but I cannot guarantee that your co-group members are going to keep it quiet, right? So again, there's only a certain amount of privacy or confidentiality that can be offered whenever there's a group. Okay. Limits of confidentiality for groups, as we just talked about. Okay. Documentation is current and records are kept secure. So we're expecting that you take notes, do your progress notes or case notes on a regular basis with your client after you talk to them or meet up with them, and also to keep them in a secure location. Okay, you should not typically take your work home with you, because let's say you put your laptop, your work laptop, in your car, and the car gets robbed or broken into, and then your computer is stolen. Now your communication, the privacy is no longer there, right? So there's many rules. Typically there's passwords, passcodes, encryptions. It might be a locked room. It might be the intranet inside an agency. An intranet is different than an internet. Intranet is the internet of a specific place where no one else can come into it. Kind of like, you know how Canvas at Cal State LA is for Cal State LA students only, right? So no one else should be able to get into it because of that, unless they have a password and they're registered as a student or a faculty or a staff. Okay. All right. Permission is obtained from clients prior to recording or observing them. So if you're going to use a recorder, you need to let them know. Provide reasonable access to records and providing assistance in understanding them. You should be able to offer an explanation of why you wrote your case notes when your clients are asking for that. Written permission is needed to transfer records to a third party. So let's say, for example, your school, the client is going to school, and the school needs to know, because they're on probation, that they're going to therapy. So then you might need to say, this is through the request of your client. I need to show proof that I'm going to therapy and working on this, Okay. Stored in an appropriate amount of time and then purged. So after a certain amount of time, let's say after 7 years, you would destroy the information that you have collected with your client, and you should let them know. Depending on the agency, they might do it themselves. It really does depend on that specific person, okay, or agency. Researchers must be accurate with proposals and obtain institutional approval for research. One thing that you need to know about research in a college setting, is that it is pretty rigorous. Okay, so you need to get all the approvals. I always tell people, whenever we're doing research in a school, it usually takes about a year to do everything. Might even be longer than that. I remember when I tried to request research, and I had to go through this thing called IRB. My IRB person quit, or everyone's IRB, like the IRB of that school quit. So for a whole semester, they were looking to hire someone else, and they never did. So we had a 1 whole semester delay on research because no one approved it, and it requires approval. And what happens with IRB is they go through your research proposal and they see whether or not it could harm anyone, hurt anyone, is it ethical, all those things, and then they'll let you know. Okay, and then you have to fix it, adjust it, and then let them see it again. So this is why it is pretty when you hear people do research in college settings or university settings, it is pretty very specific and very, very thought out and monitored. All right. Follow federal, state, and institutional guidelines regarding research. So you have to follow the rules. Is it ethical to do these things, or is it not? Especially if you're working with children, it's going to be even more specific stuff. Participant confidentiality and privacy, limits to confidentiality. We've talked about that many times. And use of quotes that may be identifiable need to have written permission. So whenever you do research and you quote someone and, they might say, I like it, right? So that one is a little bit more, general and hard to find. However, if the person goes, as let's say a Black woman with a disability with visual impairments at Cal State LA during the 2026 semester of spring, then it can become a little bit more identifiable, right? So you need to make sure that all that stuff should be like you need to let that person know that you're taking that quote from them, so that if anyone else goes, oh, I think I read about you in this research, then they can say, oh yeah, I signed, a release for that. Let's see. Let's talk about consultant capacity. When you are someone who is kind of like invited to come in to offer some perspective, right? You should also be private about the stuff that you're talking there, limits of confidentiality, and then protect the privacy of the individuals. Again, very similar. This is just in a different capacity or different situation or scenario. Professional responsibility to be competent. That means that you should be educated and experienced before working in the field. You promise to do that, right? So y'all reading your books, y'all doing really well, right? I hope so. Honest and accurate is in advertising. So if you're not a doctor, you should not say you're a doctor. Okay. Typically, whenever anyone calls me a doctor, I'm like, you know what? I'm not actually a PhD. I only have my master's. And you just need to do that. If they insist on calling you doctor even afterwards, you can't help it anymore, right? But you have done the ethical thing, which is you correct them to let them know, oh, you assume that this was my level of education, however, it is not, right? Honest and accurate in advertising, and then non-discriminatory in their work. So again, you should not discriminate against other people's for their differences. You need to monitor for effectiveness. You need to make sure are we doing things that are good, effective? Seek supervision when necessary. So let's say you might have some questions about certain things. Who are you going to ask? Your mentors? This is why it's so important to develop relationships with other people who are more professional than you are. Seeking continuing education to maintain their competence. So oftentimes you'll hear this thing called CEUs, which are continuing education units. And so let's say you get a licensure of some sort or certificate. It might require you to go to conferences or do presentations or read up in journal articles and answering questions to show them that you are up to date to the more new stuff, right? Let's say that you are a counselor and you graduated in the 1990s, right? Things have changed quite a bit since the 1990s. So you need to always show that you're reading, talking, attending conferences, and learning about what their new things are that's happening in the world. Alert to their own impairment. Seek help for their own physical and mental health if it might harm the clients. So if you are having a really bad divorce and you start drinking a lot to deal with it, obviously you're going to be impaired to help other people, right? You might say, oh yeah, I can do it. But really, if you are starting to develop alcoholism, that would be an issue that you need to deal with, right? Before you continue on. Just a thought. All right, advertising and soliciting clients. Again, you have to be professional in how you do it. There's so many great website makers now, like Squarespace, Wix, and stuff like that, and WordPress. Feel free to use those, but make sure that everything is, looking appropriate and nothing unethical as we're going through this. Only use accurate testimonials from clients from whom they receive permission. Do not recruit for a private practice through their place of employment. Only promote products accurately with enough information to allow consumers to make an informed choice. And do not use their consultation, teaching, and supervision to promote products in a deceptive manner. Again, trickery is not something that you should do as a professional, right? Be honest with who you are. There are a lot of people on social media who claim to be professionals and they're not. Okay. One thing that I always do is if I hear someone talking about therapy in a really, really either interesting or charismatic way, very rizzy, or whatever, I always go look them up to see if, where did they go to school? Did they even put down where they went to school and stuff like that? Like there are other things as well, but definitely that's what I want to know. And some of the people have not had any education. So they're kind of acting or playing like they're a counselor. So they should never say that they're a counselor if they don't have a degree in that. And we want to make sure that they're being truthful I have seen some people on social media that I'm like, wow, you're amazing. And it turns out that they're faking the whole thing. And that's really, really sad and unethical, like this chapter is talking about. All right, only claim professional qualifications that they have completed and to correct others' impressions of them. We talked a little bit about that before. Current licenses and degrees that they have earned. Do not use doctor if you do not have a doctorate degree, like we said before. And there's the PhD and EDD. There's a bunch of other ones too, but those are the two main ones. Let's see, what else is there? Yeah, I think that's it for this part right here. All right, relationships with other professionals. Interdisciplinary work with others. So basically that means that you're working with other people of other disciplines. So let's say that you are a case manager. You're going to be working with a medical doctor. You might be working with an addiction specialist. You might be working with, let's say, a teacher. You might be working with their place of work. So you might be working with a lot of different people. As a case manager, as a social worker, this is what you're going to do. So you're connecting people for your client to make them become a better person. Right? Respect professionals in other careers. Work to develop strong interdisciplinary relationships. Keep the focus on the client. If there's any conflict, work to resolve it within the team. So let's say there's one person that you're connecting them with and they're not answering the phone. Try to resolve it, right? Hire competent staff with qualifications. So again, you need to ask your clients and ask your, I'm sorry, not your clients, but ask your employees if you're becoming the boss. Find out where they are education-wise, experience-wise, right? I'm always curious whenever interns come to a place, hey, where are you from? Where are you studying? What are your passions? Those are things that I need to know so I understand the qualifications so I can let you know where you can go do your internship, let's say. If there are negative conditions, work within the organization to resolve it. And if it does not work, report the appropriate agencies or organizations who have oversight. So here, typically, in counseling especially, if you have a problem with a person you're working with, go deal with it with them first. You're all counselors, right? Or you're in the helping field. You should be able to help yourself and others immediately first. However, if it doesn't work out, you might want to talk to a superior and then go from there, okay? If the superior of the agency is not willing to budge or whatever, then you can go into the higher ones. I would never go from my coworker having like a disagreement and then reporting them to a licensing board immediately. Maybe it's an honest, mistake. We don't know, right? Let's figure it out first and then help them so that they continue to be counselors as well as you become maintain being a counselor as well. All right, do not harass or dismiss an employee who has raised concern. Again, if someone brings up certain issues, it might be a little bit tough, but you got to deal with it, right? You got to live with it, evolve, adapt, and stuff like that. Coaching and consultations. Believe it or not, a coach is not an actual degree that you can get. Anyone can call themselves a coach, okay? Anyone can call themselves a consultant. So whenever you see the word lifestyle coach, right? Some of them might actually have a degree and they'll let you know, right? They'll say, I have a master's in counseling, right? But a lot of coaching, you do not need any type of education, which is why on social media, it is so deceptive when you see the word coach. What does that mean? Okay. Must have appropriate competencies for the role. So again, you must be educated and experienced, like have working experience typically. Know the interventions. So you need to know all the different types of interventions in counseling. Encourage the consultee's growth towards self-direction. So again, helping them become that autonomous, or reach autonomy. We talked about those value systems that we talked about earlier. Help them get to so that they can function on their own without any help. Evaluation, assessment, and interpretation. So now we're going to start talking about testing. Okay, so some of you all will be working where you need them, your client, to fill out a questionnaire, answer a question, or something like that, or take a test. Okay, so if that happens, we want to make sure it is fair. Okay, here's an example. There was a company that was forcing everyone to take this high school test that wasn't really necessary, but they were forcing it all because typically minorities are less educated and they would not pass this test. But those who were Caucasian or white would pass this test. So what happens is those people were able to get promotions, whereas the minorities who have less education. However, they can still do the job. Remember, this test was not required, right? And so it kept all these minorities from ever going above where they were position wise. Okay. So these organizations like that were going to help and say, why was this test even being put into this situation? Okay. All right. So the ACA and NCDA formed the Joint Committee in Testing Practices, developed the Code of Ethics of Fair Testing Practices in Education in 2004, administer and score tests correctly and fairly, and report and interpret test results accurately and clearly. Should provide clients with an instrument, the use of scores, and additional information. The tests must be valid and reliable. So those are two key terms when it comes to how a test is valued. Okay, so reliable means that every time you take that same test, the results should be similar. They don't have to be 100% identical. Let's say there's a test that you took and you took it on Monday and you scored a 78, right? And then you took it a month later and you got an 80, okay? And then you took it a month later and you got a 75, right? So those are all kind of similar numbers. So it's consistent. This test, every time you take it, will yield similar results. That's what reliable is. Valid is it measuring what it says it's going to measure? So let's say, for example, when you take it, you're asking questions about depression, right? But it's really measuring anxiety, right? So then it's not actually valid, right? Because we're trying to figure out what their depression is, not their anxiety. So typically, a lot of the assessments that you use at your agency have already had high reliability and validity, okay? But the ones that are being created, they're new ones, let's say in schools, when people are, testing them out, like we talked about before. When we do research, we need to test it all out to make sure that it's reliable and valid. If it's not, then we have to move on to something new, okay? Client welfare is important. And counselors need to be competent in the tools that they use. So it reminds you need to do good to your client, and also you need to be educated and experienced in what you're doing. That's what we're expecting you all to be. All right, providing career services, online technology, and social media, similar to Section A, but acknowledges the additional security and technical concerns that are part of using online services. So what that is talking about is, how technology changes all the time? Right, we have this thing called Skype. Do any of you know what Skype is? No, it's no longer being used. Now we have FaceTime. Now we have Zoom. Now we have all the technology changes so fast, and we need to make sure that it is protective of your client if you're going to use it. Okay. Before the pandemic happened, none of those things were allowed. You had to, as a company, buy very specialized software to do something like over the camera, okay? Because it needed to be secured and confidential that no one could hack, right? Remember during the pandemic when people were using Zoom and then people were hacking into classroom lectures and were showing inappropriate things? That means that is not very, very secure or confidential, right? And then Zoom realized, this is crazy. So then they started doing, where you needed a password, a passcode to come into a room, all those different things, right? And that's part of what's going on when it comes to technology, is that it keeps on changing. It is kind of a headache, but it is the reality of this world. All right, different states or different countries will add more legal concerns. Some countries are very, very protective of their users. I would say Europe is very, very particular, very, very protective of the everyday person versus America. All right, counselors must know issues with technology and counseling. So again, the counselor, you need to know how to use the technology. I mean, nothing was sadder than, your teacher who didn't understand how to use Zoom, right? Must know other states' legal issues. So let's say you're working in a different state. How does that work when it comes to rules? Because again, every state has different sets of rules, right? So for example, someone who's threatening to harm themselves and they're in a different state, what are your what are you gonna how do you operate, or how do you go from there, right? What do you do? All right. Um, extra steps to verify the client's identity. So again, you need to know who it is, because online anyone can just turn off their computer and you'll never know who they are, right? So maybe a webcam is something that is necessary to justify, or not justify, verify who it is, so forth and so on. Okay. Um, benefits of benefits and limitations of using online services. Obviously, a person with a disability who cannot, let's say, travel online would be fantastic, right? Or maybe someone with less money who doesn't have to spend money on a bus fare or whatever, or Uber fare, it's going to help them as well. But at the same time, let's say that your client is trying to deal with anxiety and socialization, and then they never socialize because they're always in their house on their Zoom, right? So again, it does really depend on that situation. Professional boundaries, you both may be in your own home, so how do you present yourselves in your home through your cameras or whatever? The client's ability to use the technology is on the counselor's responsibility. So one of the things that happened during the pandemic was we realized that not everyone had great internet services, right? Not everyone had a computer desktop. So all these things became major challenges and barriers. So now it looks like almost a lot of us have phones, right? But before, not everyone did. So how was that fair for everyone? And also internet speed and stuff like that. And it is up to the client to be able to provide those things. You know, obviously you not spend your own money, but you need to resolve how to do that before you can do counseling with that person. Differences between in-person and online counseling, you can imagine there's a lot of stuff that are going to be contrast and difference. I myself prefer in-person because I can read your body language. I can see your entire body as opposed to just your head. Have you ever seen anyone put the laptop on and then all you see is their chin and their forehead, and that's it? You never see anything else. And then the ceiling. So all those things can influence how you see the situation with your client, whether or not you're able to read their nonverbal behaviors. Social media, counselors keep their professional and personal social media sites separate. If you are going to work in this field, I recommend you have your own personal one and then your work one. Okay. If you have a work one, then maybe people will be less likely to try to snoop and find out what your personal one is, right? Make your personal one private so that other people can't find it. But your other one may be visible and not necessarily anything personal about parties and stuff like that, right? Accurate in presentation and presenting their training and the qualifications on the site. Again, if you say you're a therapist, I always look to see what your degrees are, maybe what school you went to, your experience and stuff like that. I always want to know what it is if it's on social media. And social media is part of informed consent, limits of use. So again, you need to potentially put that into your informed consent to talk about that. And we'll discuss this as we go along. Supervision, training, and teaching. So now this is kind of applying to where you are. However, it could be also you as a professional supervisor, right? But either way, your supervisor, you are going to put your client's welfare as paramount. Paramount is just a fancy word for being the most important or the top, okay? Monitor, supervise these cases and meet with them regularly. So let's say that you are a supervisor and I am your intern, right? So you need to look at my work, check my work to make sure that I'm doing everything correctly. If not, offer suggestions on how I can improve, right? Sometimes communication isn't so great, but hopefully you're hoping that everyone has a good sense of communication. No one's going to be offended. And remember, if a mentor or a supervisor says that you need to change certain things, say thank you, right? And then consider that they're just there to help you. They don't hate you. They don't think you're stupid or anything like that. They're just saying, hey, you might want to consider changing this. Okay. Obviously everyone's communication styles are going to be different. So be aware of that, and remind yourself always that your mentor supervisor usually, right, if they're good, are there to help you. All right. Ensure that they are competent to provide supervision. So this is something that once you go into your master's, before you can do an internship, your program needs to vet your supervisor. Okay. Do they have a degree that allows them to be able to be a supervisor, right? Not a supervision degree per se, but do they have, let's say, a master's in counseling or a PhD in counseling or psychology, so that, they know more than you do, right? So they can offer more help and mentorship and supervision. Educators indicate when techniques are unproven. So when we talk in class, we talk about, what has been proven and what has not been proven, what has been effective and not been effective. Why is it that certain things, people suggest or thought about, but then they go away, right? And that's probably because they have been unproven when they actually tested it out. Ensure students are qualified to placements and sites and are prepared for the students. So ensure students are qualified to placements and sites are prepared for the students. So what that means is if you are the ones in charge in the program, let's say your client is going to go work at a specific agency. You need to make sure that the agency is going to provide your student with knowledge and experience that is appropriate for their education. Research and publication. So let's talk about when people are doing research, right? So that means you're doing an experiment with, like, let's say 100 people. You need to be able to safeguard the rights and research of these research participants that are participating and doing you a favor by doing this, right? So that means that people should not be able to identify who it is in the results. There should be a coding system to it. And if you go into your master's program or your doctorate program, you will start to learn about all those details. Okay, must not have personal relationships with research participants. Basically, that means do not have sex with your research participants or any other type of relationship, financially or anything like that. Report all results accurately, and that's really important. Here's an example. Do not fudge your results because of the way you want to prove something. For example, the really famous one is the drug MDMA or Molly, right? We were told that if you did Molly a lot, it would mess up your brain. And the reason why was because there was one researcher who did this research and said, look at our data. This is what it says, right? And so this is why you probably heard people say, don't do Molly or MDMA because it's going to affect your brain. Actually, we find out later on that he had faked all his numbers or results. So now we have all this research that read that article and then said, based on this research, we're doing this type of research now, or we've made this specific decision about certain things. So do you see how unethical and how horribly that has influenced everything around them, right? Just this research article. So that doctor researcher was actually, I believe, no longer allowed to do research. I think they lost their rights to their degrees and stuff like that, or their abilities, their credits. I'm sorry, their accreditation and stuff like that. So you need to be honest about that. And you know what? When we do research, sometimes we fail, and that is okay. There's more failures than success, right? But that's part of learning and education and stuff like that. This is a scientific method where we test things out. If it doesn't work out, then we move forward. We try to find out other reasons why things are happening the way they are. When publishing work, follow all the guidelines related to appropriate authorship, credit, and publication practices. So wherever you submit your work, your research work to, they will have a set of rules that they expect that you hold on to, right? Or you uphold. So again, ethical issues when it comes to research. And the last section is resolving ethical issues. Are there potential conflicts between the ethics code and the law? So that might also happen. When ethical violations occur, attempt informal resolutions prior to reporting the ethical violation. So again, if something happens, let's talk it out really quickly with the person who's doing the stuff that could be considered a violation and understand why that's happening. Okay, and then from there, if it cannot be resolved, then we move forward with reporting. If formal complaints need to be made, done after professional consultation. So again, if that happens, you need to talk to your supervisor most likely or the agency itself before you go forward with it, right? And you can decide whether or not it's good or not and then move forward, or you can say, you know what, things have been resolved. All right, this is the end of the chapter. Bye.